Let me introduce B. Helft. B. Helft is a certified master gardener who gives presentations on many horticultural subjects throughout the Nassau County. She enjoys gardening, especially growing vegetables and other edibles, and has turned her suburban backyard into a mini farm. As a board member of Plant a Row for the Hungry, she is dedicated to educating the community about how to grow vegetables at home and encourages everyone to donate extra produce to those in need. B is also a member of ReWild Long Island, focusing her efforts on spreading the word about the benefits of planting native plants. Her other area of gardening interest is experimenting with various composting techniques. A perennial student, B dedicates several hours a week taking courses relevant to gardening. So without further delay, I'll hand it over to B.
Thank you very much, Tiash, and welcome everybody. As I was thinking about this talk, I was actually full of mixed emotions because I was sad that it was snowing today. I wished it had this talk 2 weeks before so that we could take advantage of the snow blanketing all of our little mini greenhouses and keeping them nice and warm. On the other hand, I'm very happy that it's snowing and I can be indoors and talk to you via Zoom. So here we are. What is winter sowing? It does not at all surprise me that there are many people who are new to this topic because I myself have been relatively a newcomer about 3 years ago, even though this technique is in theory about 20 years old, but none of us had ever done it for a long, long time. And now that I know what this is, I'm hooked. And there are lots of reasons why I wouldn't do anything else. So basically, winter sowing is creating mini greenhouses, planting seeds in those greenhouses, placing them outside when it gets cold, and then letting nature foster a very naturally timed, strong plant generating high percentage germination of our favorite plants. And then we wait for them to sprout. The most common of these types of greenhouses is something that you see here, which are the gallon translucent. They don't have to be transparent as long as you can see through them. Jugs of milk or water or juice. You can certainly use any of those as long as you rinse them. And that's what we'll be talking about first. So why should I winter sow? I mean, the idea of starting seeds indoors has been the common thinking when anybody says, oh, I've got to start my seeds early. But why would I want to winter sow outdoors? Well, for many of the same reasons that you start seeds inside. First of all, you can grow varieties that you don't find in local garden centers. And these are very exciting varieties, especially lately. There's been an incredible amount of research on what the needs of home growers are. So you will find varieties that are dwarf plants, although full-size vegetables, for example. You will find plants that you can grow in hanging baskets that produce food. We've never had that before. So there are lots and lots of reasons to find varieties that are also bred for disease resistance and high productivity, and lots of other reasons why you'd like to grow them, but can't find them as a plant anywhere. You can have plants in a winter sowing greenhouse, even if you don't know where to plant them yet. And very often that's the case. You know that you'd like to plant things, but your garden is, it's in need of rearranging. And of course, we're going to try something new. But you can have these plants ready whenever you've decided where you want them to be. You can start the seeds that are cold tolerant as soon as it gets cold. So you could have actually done this last month, but you don't have to. You can actually start them now, February, March, even April, if you have warm weather plants like tomatoes that are happy to stay in a little container for the 6 to 8 weeks that they need to prepare themselves for the big wide world. And the best thing about winter sowing for me is that I don't need a lot of equipment that I did have at one time. I had seed mats that are heating. I had grow lights. I had tons of trays, but not a lot of space to put all of that stuff in. So you don't really need indoor space. You don't need the kids banging into everything or the husband saying, what a mess you've made here. It's really a great idea to have everything outdoors. It's also inexpensive. A lot of the things that you are going to be using are things that we are recycling. And we know that ReWild is very big on the idea of reuse and recycle. So this fits right into our mission. The very good thing about winter sowing is because it's outside where seeds normally are, they don't need the process that we have to go through if we are seeding indoors. They're already acclimated to the weather, so they don't need to go through the process of hardening off, which is a process where you bring a tray that's been in a very temperature controlled environment of indoors, take it outside for an hour, bring it back. Next day, take it there for 2 hours, bring it back until finally it gets used to the outdoors. These seeds have been used to the outdoors from the beginning, so there's no reason to go through all that. There's also no what's called damping off, which is a fungal disease that happens when there's too much moisture, and indoors, that's something you have to be careful of. It doesn't happen. We don't have the insects that fungus gnats, for example, will often come when there are indoor seeds started. So all of that is gone. None of that is what I consider work. And here, what could be better? Nature is your partner. So what you're doing is actually utilizing outdoor light, outdoor temperatures, and outdoor moisture to drive the entire process of getting the seeds germinated, having the seedlings nurtured until it's ready to be put into the garden. The bottom line is this is low maintenance, not no maintenance. There is a little, we'll talk about it, but it leaves you time for doing lots of other things, being with family and friends. In my case, in the winter, one of my biggest joys is reading fabulous seed catalogs. And the best thing about this as a family affair, it's fun to do with the kids, especially when they pick out the seeds, they put them outside, and then every once in a while they poke inside the hole and see what's going on. It's a lot of fun. So what materials do you need? Well, the first thing is you're going to need something to act as a greenhouse. Most common are gallon jugs. Again, you can use half-gallon jugs as well if you only have a few seeds to sow. But gallon jugs is the most common. And you could also use clamshells and takeout containers. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But for now, we're going to focus on the gallon jugs, which you see here on the bottom. There are also trays of things at the top here that you could also use. Now, in terms of what the soil medium should be, this is not a hard and fast rule. There are some people that advocate using seed starter mix, but I do not. And the reason is that seed starter mix has no nutrition at all. It's very light and it's very easy for the seeds to start, but the seeds in this greenhouse are going to be there for quite a while. So you want them to have nourishment in addition to just starting, which is why I recommend potting mix, or if you have a potting mix that's very heavy, and there are some that have all kinds of things added to it, best not to buy something with all these additives. Having organic potting mix is great, but you could throw a little bit of seed starter mix in it to lighten it up. one of the things you don't want to do is use garden soil. And I have watched, I don't know, at least 50 videos on winter sowing. And I have to say, I've seen the whole gamut, including people who use garden soil. But garden soil contains microorganisms that could disrupt the process, and insects, and God only knows what else. So I don't recommend garden soil. You remember that this is a very confined neighborhood and you want to protect it as much as possible. So I would avoid using garden soil. So between the drying out of the seed starting mix quickly, and you have to keep watering it more, and it not having nutrition, seed starter mix is not for me. You'll also need some cutting tools to cut the design of the greenhouse so that you can put the soil in and that you can have drainage. And for that, I recommend a regular pair of scissors, a utility knife to start the slit that you're going to make with the scissors. But for holes, I recommend an awl or an ice pick, which is a serious tool. So you don't want to do that with small children, but it works really well in poking small holes. I prefer small holes for drainage. It's possible people have been reporting slugs coming into the greenhouses. So you don't want the holes to be very large, rather have more of them, but not as big. The utility knife, some people cut holes by stabbing the container and then rotating it. That makes a really big hole. And if that works for you, that's fine. I will continue to use what I found has worked for me. Now, in terms of labeling these containers and the labels that you're going to be putting inside the container, you need something that is going to hold up in the weather. And so I recommend a garden marker. I don't recommend a Sharpie because the Sharpie marker will fade over time. And once the lid is open and you plant things out in the garden, you can have the labels that you stuck into the box go right into the garden, so you'll remember what it is. And then by the end of the season, you still want to be able to read what it is. So I recommend a specific thing called a garden marker. A China pencil is something that you write on plates. So if there are stores that sell plates, you will see the price written with something called China pencil. That will also work. Now, in terms of what to close everything with, you'll see down at the bottom, there is tape. And what I found works best is duct tape. It does not seem to be bothered by the elements, the rain, the snow, the cold, the wind. I have tried other tape that I happened to have at the time, and packing tape did not work. The whole thing just disintegrated and it didn't stay closed. So I recommend duct tape. And you're going to want to keep the moisture level consistent. And so over time, if things dry out, if we have a dry spell with no rain or snow, you're going to want to spray the seedlings or the seeds, if they haven't yet germinated, with a spray bottle. You need to water delicately. If you try to water with a watering can, you're going to move everything around, and that's just going to be wreaking havoc to your poor little plants. And one of the things that we need to do is pre-moisten the soil that we put into these little greenhouses. And for that, I use either a potting tray or a bucket or something where I can combine my soil medium with water. And we'll talk a little bit about that. One of the things that I have also seen people use to make holes for drainage is a soldering iron or something that heats the plastic to melt it. That is also something I do not recommend because it puts that plastic vapor into the air, which you breathe. Now, you might say, well, it's only a little bit. And yes, it's only a little bit if you're doing 40 or 50 containers, it's not such a little bit. You're probably doing that part of the process indoors. And we don't want to put any more plastic into the environment that's already there. So that is my suggestion. Now, there are lots of things that you can recycle, not only the plastic jugs. So to make your labels for the inside of these greenhouses, you can take old yogurt containers or other kinds of containers that you might have and cut the sides into strips. And you can write right on that on the inside. It's nice and blank. And then you don't have to buy any labels to put in your jugs. So I want to thank the Port Washington Starbucks because I, in general, don't buy things in gallon jugs. And they do. They buy them by the ton for all the different kinds of milk that they use for their coffee. And the people in the Port Washington branch of Starbucks, Jen, the manager, and Gio, the barista, have been really fabulous in collecting them for me. So I want to thank them. Without them, I would not be winter sowing. But I have a suggestion for ReWild. I know that in the past, there have been plastic pot collections in the ReWild Thomas Dodge homestead. There was a project where people would bring any plastic pots that they bought plants in at the nurseries, and they were collected, and then they were brought either back to the greenhouse companies that created those plants, or people took them for what they needed. And it became very overwhelming. There were so many plastic pots that they basically stopped the collection. But wouldn't it be awesome if they collected gallon jugs? There are so many people that buy milk, buy distilled water, buy all kinds of things in gallon jugs and just put them into the recycling where we could really, really use them. You don't have to do it all year. So I'm hoping somebody from the committee is watching, maybe just the last few months of the year, and then let people know, find a way to let people know if there are any to pick up, limit the number that you could pick up per visit per day, because otherwise I know even for myself, I would come and take all of them. So there's just a suggestion, but I digress. So let's go back. How to prepare the jug. Well, you want to punch holes at the bottom of the jug, as you see here with a screwdriver. I also punch holes along the edge, along the bottom. I want to make sure that there's drainage, especially if there's a heavy rain. But many people that I have watched do this do not punch holes around there. I found that it didn't hurt, so I keep doing it. In the beginning, when I was new at this, I took the label off of the jug, figuring, well, it would just let more light in, but it is a royal pain in the neck to take off all those labels. It doesn't come off easily, and it's not worth the time. So don't do it. But then you're going to cut all the way around the edge of the jug. You're going to leave a little bit near the handle. So you're going to cut about 1 inch below the handle all the way around. You're going to have a hinge, which allows you to open this jug as much as possible, but it doesn't separate the two parts, which makes it a lot easier to manage as you are working with this. I mentioned you want to pre-moisten the soil. So you do that outside of this particular environment. And then what you want to do is put 3 to 4 inches in the bottom of each jug, leaving a little space at the top so that water doesn't overflow and that you don't have any issues with overrun. Depending on what you're planting, you could get away with 3 inches. So if you're planting something that you know does not have deep roots, 3 inches is okay. If you're planting seeds that are natives or that are perennials, you definitely want to have more soil. You don't want to get to the point where this is root bound. Goodness knows that would be a problem. So, you can use your judgment. In terms of how to sow the seeds into this little greenhouse, there's a lot to know, and I'm going to talk about that a few slides from now. What I would like to do is continue with the process of what to do, and then we'll talk about the seeds. One of the things about how to pre-moisten the soil, you want to have as much water in the soil that if you hold the soil in your hand, it stays together, but you don't want so much so that when you squeeze it, water comes out. So that's the wet sponge analogy works here as well. That's what you want to have as the moistening level of your soil. Okay, so assuming that we've sown the seeds, then we're going to put a label inside. That label is the one that we can then transfer into our garden when we transplant the seedlings that have successfully germinated. You want to close your jug with duct tape, as you see here. Here's a Lobelia cardinalis, a beautiful red native flower that is being sown in this particular jug. We also want to label the outside of the jug because it's going to be very hard when you poke your eye into that little hole to see what the label is. And there are many reasons why you want to know what you've planted in there. Many people write this right on the duct tape. I tend to put a little extra piece of tape near the top of the jug because it's easier for me when I have my 40 or 50 jugs to see what's going on in each one. Otherwise, I have to move each one away from each other and see what's inside. So for me, I don't label it around the closing of the duct tape, but I put a little label at the top. It's a good idea to put the date as well as the name of the plant. That gives you a sense of how long it's been out there. And, you're going to have research and data to have a sense of whether it's really been long enough. I mean, nature knows what it's doing, so it's going to tell you whether it's long enough, but you would like to be somewhat informed as well. And the most important thing with these jugs is to throw away the cap. Unfortunately, those are usually not recyclable, but you don't want it covered. You've got to make sure it's exposed to the elements, the rain, the light, the snow, everything. You need to have it open. Now, where do you put these guys? Well, you want to put them where they're in the elements. You don't want to put them close to the house where it's covered by an eave. You don't want it under an awning. You don't want it sheltered. You want them out there. And you want to let the light in, so you don't want it in the shade. If you put it on a concrete patio, sometimes it's too cold down there. So it's better on the grass or in the soil or on top of a raised bed if nothing's growing there. One of the problems that people have mentioned, and I have not had that problem, but I can see it being a problem, is slugs getting into these little greenhouses. So what I have seen as a solution to this is to put a paper towel at the bottom of the jug before you fill it with soil, but I don't recommend that because it gets moldy, it gets yucky, it just creates an inhospitable environment for the roots of the plant. But what you can do is put some kind of a barrier between the soil and the jug itself. So you could put it on a potting bench, or I've been lucky in that I had a friend who was changing the windows of their house, and I asked for the screens from those windows. So I put my screens and then I put these on top. But there are lots and lots of ways that you could protect this. Okay, so now it's outside. And one of the things you're going to want to make sure of is that it's always moist. And one way to tell is to get a sense of how heavy that jug is when it's moist. So you can monitor it just by weight. You can look to see if it looks dry, or you can monitor the weather and know that it hasn't rained and it's been really windy, and so no moisture has been really around. And then you could spray water if you need to. Do not use a watering can. You absolutely need a mist so that it doesn't disturb anything that's going on. And once you either see seedlings starting, as we see here, or you're watching the temperatures and you're watching the frost date, which is an approximate date of like 30% chance that it's not going to freeze after that date. You can open these jugs and let more of the sun in. If it's going to be cold that night, you can flip it closed again. So that is a little bit of work of opening and closing them as the temperature warrants. The frost date, the last frost date for 2024 in the area that I live in, which is Manhasset, Port Washington, is April 6th. You can find out your frost date by going to the Old Farmer's Almanac site, and you put in your zip code and it tells you what the first frost date, which is in the fall. Here we are, November 6th this year, 2024, and the last frost date. And then you'll have a sense of what your growing season is. In our case, it's 211 days, which is the same as it was last year. But 2 years ago and 3 years ago, the growing season was actually shorter. 3 years ago by 10 days. So things are warming. The frost date, the last frost date is later. The last frost date is earlier. The first frost date is later. So we're getting a wider range of times that we have growing. And when we talk about planting these things into the garden at the right time, what is the right time? Well, you're going to see a number of true leaves. When the seed first germinates, they're just kind of generic baby leaves that are not indicative of the kind of plant it is. But after you see 2 sets of true leaves, they're called, which are the leaves that are characteristic of the plant that you are trying to grow, that's when you could plant it. You don't have to. You can still wait. Remember that there's nutrition in these little greenhouses now. So you can wait until the weather warms up enough and that you have time to plant. If you're doing a lot of these guys, it's a nice idea to have an assembly line approach and do preparation for each of the steps before you do any of it. So rather than just cut one jug, fill it up, plant it, tape it, and so on, put them all out, cut them all up, line up the seeds, write the labels, get this enough soil moistened for all of them, and then you can go ahead and you'll be done in short order. And it's a great idea for a garden party. So if you have friends that also have an interest in doing this, get together and do it together. It's a great way to build a community. So there's the question of what seeds are going to work in this new technique. Well, the truth of the matter is just about anything will work. I have been successful, and not with everything, but I have been successful with some of the new types of tomatoes and peppers and herbs that I have experimented with. But the most common seeds to try are the seeds that need the cold anyway. So anything that needs nature to help germinate, the seeds that help, what does it mean to germinate the seed? To break down that coat so that the plant that's inside will be able to pop out and be welcome in the world. Some seeds, and many of them are native seeds, they require cold, just cold, fertilization, or moist cold stratification. And you will see if you do research, and I'll talk a little bit about the kind of way that you can do research online where you're going to get, for the most part, reasonable research-based answers, is to research what it is you want to plant, even if you have a seed packet which has information on it. But certainly if you have seeds that somebody gave you that are natives, that are not food, you can't just automatically collect seeds from the previous year and expect them to be what you're anticipating food-wise. They may actually have been hybridized and will produce fruit that is more one parent than the next and not exactly what you wanted. But with native seeds, just like human beings, every seed is unique. And so if things were pollinated from different areas and you get a seed that was from one purple parent and from one white parent, and it turns out that it's a pink flower, wow, all that does is add to your garden. So lots of ways of collecting your own seeds that you can try and move all over your garden. Of course, very many of these seeds just will naturally fall and germinate themselves. We don't need to do anything. Self-seeding plants are another thing to try. But native plants are great. Perennials, anything that is around the whole year, expects to be in weather like this. So if it's perennial in this zone, then that's also a good candidate. Anything that's a cold tolerant annual, and in the beginning, right now when it's really cold outside, cool weather vegetables like our lettuces, our cilantro, our kale, our broccolis, the brassicas, all of those are great. But you can also try things, and this is my perspective, where you need to start this ahead of the growing season, because your growing season of 211 days is not long enough for production, serious production of things that we normally grow at home: tomatoes, eggplants, peppers, herbs. So all those things that need a long growing season, those are great to start winter sowing. Anything that turns out to bolt when the warm weather hits, you want to start in the cold so that the sooner you can plant it in the ground and get something viable and usable, that's something that makes sense. And cilantro comes to mind because that will bolt the minute the weather warms up. Lots of flowers also need advance warning, essentially, for this to grow. Things like calendula, marigolds, if you're growing them from seed, poppies, zinnias, columbine, all of these things would benefit from winter sowing. But there are things that you shouldn't winter sow. Bulbs, tubers, tropical plants. Those things are just not meant for this kind of mini greenhouse. Tropical plants you have to dig up in the fall. They can't tolerate the winter anyway. Some bulbs and tubers do stay in the ground, but they are not good for winter sowing. Another thing I don't recommend are root vegetables, things where the root itself is what we eat. So carrots especially, but radishes, beets, turnips, parsnips, none of those things really like to be transplanted. And so having them here, you're going to have to transplant them. You're much better off planting them in the ground at the time, knowing what the days to maturity is, and then time it in a way that you get the vegetables that you want. Many of these root vegetables also benefit from what's called succession planting. So if you get a packet of radishes, and this is funny to me because I've seen this so often, typically a packet of radish seeds has 200 seeds in it. Well, I don't know anybody that can eat 200 radishes, but if you plant a few and then 2 weeks later plant a few, they have about a 1 month maturity time. Then you can have radishes, a few of them all season, or you could plant lots more than you really need and give them to Plant a Row for the Hungry, for our many, many food insecure families in town, and that would be a real blessing as well. But what I also don't recommend for winter sowing are things that are really happy to be direct sown. Things like cucumbers and squashes. They go right in the ground. And again, they don't need to be transplanted. They germinate really, really quickly. No sense going through this process, even if it's relatively low maintenance, for anything that you can sow directly. So how many seeds to plant? Now let's get into the actual planting of the seeds that we are going to be doing. Well, how many plants do you want? If you are planting tomato seeds, unless you have a lot of property, you don't want to be planting many, many seeds. And these will have a life of 4 to 5 years in the packet. So you don't need to be planting them all at once. Natives and plants that can be planted in clumps where we're not going to be separating them, we're going to just take a clump of seedlings and plant that right in the ground. You can sow those very heavily in the little container. But plants that need room so that you're going to separate them when you plant one at a time, then you want to be careful about where you plant them. And things like tomatoes, I don't plant more than 7 seeds and sometimes 5, depending on what kind of a plant it is, in one particular jug. Now, in terms of how deep to plant, if you have a seed packet, it will tell you how deep to plant it. Very often it will say surface sow, in which case you just sprinkle it on top of the soil and you gently press it down so that the seeds make contact with the soil. If it says 1/8, 1/4, 1 inch, then press it in, but cover it lightly with additional potting soil so that it is in the dark. Life is so interesting. Some seeds require dark to germinate, some require light to germinate, and you need to know which is which. If you try to germinate something by pushing it into the soil, but it needs light to germinate, it won't. And things like carrots, you can actually plant the seeds, sowing them at the surface, and then cover them with a wooden plank, not in a jug, but in the ground. Cover them with a wooden plank and don't look at it for 2 weeks because it needs total darkness in order to germinate. So everyone is different, which is why gardening is so fun. You're doing a lot of research and learning a lot every time you garden. Then you want to take your spray bottle and water the soil again and water the seeds into the soil. If you're doing this a lot, it's great to have one of these pump sprayers where you're putting the pressure in and then you just push the handle and you can spray to your heart's content. You can spray all of them all at once. If you don't have a seed packet or no information, here's what I would like to get you in the habit of doing. If you ever look for anything online that is, in theory, something you want backed by research, whatever your question is that's garden related, add the word extension to the question. So how deep to plant Monarda extension? You don't need the quotes. That is going to bring up at the top of the search results things from cooperative extensions that are based in universities. So in New York, the cooperative extension is Cornell. New Jersey, it's Rutgers. Pennsylvania, University of Pennsylvania. Locally, University of Maryland. And you want to look for a site that has roughly our zone, our growing conditions. And then you'll look at the answers you get from that. Now, what if you have old seeds? What if you're going to waste all the time and then nothing is going to germinate? It's not a bad idea before you do any of this to do what's called a germination test. And what you do is you take 10 seeds, you get a moist paper towel, wrap them up in it, put them in a Ziploc bag, put it in a dark place, and then find out what the expected germination time is. It will say either on the packet, or you can do the research. It might say germination in 10 to 14 days. So after 14 days, you go to this little bag, you open it up, and you count how many of those seeds have germinated. If 7 or more have germinated, that's a 70% success rate, they're good to go. Even if you buy fresh seeds in a packet, you're not going to have 100% germination rate. And in fact, there are some seed companies like Fedco that will tell you on the packet 98% germination rate or 89% germination rate. So you have a sense of what to expect. If the seeds, like 4 to 7 of them, go into germination mode, then you can still use those, just overseed so that you're not going to be getting so many germinating. If it's less than 40%, just take the whole thing and put it in your compost pile. Now, when should you winter sow? So if your packet says something like start seeds 6 to 8 weeks before the average last frost, then you need to know when the average last frost is. In our case, it's April 6th here. And so you can ask Google when 6 weeks is, or 8 weeks before that. And you can plant them in your little winter sowing environment. Or the truth of the matter is, it doesn't matter. You can plant it anytime. I mean, these dates are just to give you a sense that you don't have to plant everything all at once. You can plant the vegetables that you're going to be putting out in the garden at the middle of May. You can start those in March and April. Things that really need the summer, you can put in the end of April. But things like native plants or perennials that need cold stratification, 60 days, 90 days, 30 days, you've got to have those days. So you need to put them in now, February, in enough time. I mean, God knows, we get this crazy snow and then we get a 60-degree day. So who knows what the weather's going to bring. But again, natives are used to it. They've been here so many millions of years before us that they've seen it all, not only the lately crazy weather that we've had. Now, there are other types of containers that you can use besides jugs. You also want to do the same thing to them. You want to put holes on the bottom at least and the top. But certain things that are recommended, like clamshells or takeout containers, you want to make sure that it's sturdy enough to withstand the weight of the snow and squirrels, who are going to be very curious as to what all this is. I think that something like this is too thin, and I would not recommend using it. But there are other methods that people have used that do work. So here is the case of a large storage tub that has holes on the bottom and holes in each of these little pots that were planted. These happen to be Jiffy pots, so peat moss pots. And what's nice about this method is that you don't have to worry about disturbing any of the roots. You just take the whole pot and plant it. I've seen this technique with plastic pots in here as well. Same idea, you label everything. This person originally had only the Jiffy pots, but found that they dried out very, very quickly. And so they added soil all around it, and that made it a little easier. Now you see there were a lot of holes here, and that's important because you really wanted all that moisture to get into this large container. The other thing you have to be careful about with a technique like this is that there doesn't seem to be a lot of distance between the top of the Jiffy pot and the top of the container. So when the seedlings start to grow, they're going to hit that sealing pretty quickly, and you really want to make sure that that doesn't happen. They could be bending and stunting and not great. It also seems not to have a lot of space for the moisture to reside, and sometimes that causes things to dry out too. I've seen another situation where everything I told you is out the window. So here is a shoebox with a completely non-transparent top, lots of holes, and very successful. This was a wildflower mix that's just about ready to go out in the garden. So I would say that you don't have to be limited by the rules. It has to be a gallon jug. It has to be this or it has to be that. I would say that if you understand the principles, you can make it work, and it's always an experiment. And that's the fun thing about this. Hopefully, it'll be a successful one. But take a look at this. This uses Ziploc bags. And this was lettuce that was successfully grown in Ziploc bags. So the way this was marked, all these little things at the bottom are holes for drainage. And these two holes at the top are to put sticks. You don't have to buy dowels. You can use branches from your garden to hold the bag up so that it doesn't flop over. And this was something that I saw on YouTube with the person calling themselves the Southern Daisy. And I thought, well, I'm not going to watch anything on winter sowing from the Southern Daisy. We're not in the South. That has nothing to do with me. But she had so many winter sowing videos. I said, all right, let me watch one. Well, it turns out that this Southern Daisy is from North Carolina in zone, drum roll, 7B. We are now 7B. In case you have not been made aware that the USDA finally changed its hardiness zone map, something that we've known for a long time that we were 7B, but they finally caught up. And so, yeah, so this works. This is the same zone as us. North Carolina is growing all kinds of things that we are growing now too. We could never grow crepe myrtles before, but now you see them all over the place. They've migrated up because our climate is that much warmer. And I was looking for a long time for someone who did a parallel experiment, someone who took the same seeds, sowed them indoors, and sowed them with winter sowing to find out which worked better. And this is about a half-an-hour video called Does Winter Sowing Vegetables Work? And it was specifically about vegetables. She had mixed success. Basically, this is broccoli. Look how great this broccoli looks indoors. And this is the broccoli that came out of the winter sowing container. But interestingly enough, this was one of her winter sowing successes, because even though for the most part, the plants were ready to plant much later in the winter sowing than in her indoor sowing, the broccoli that was produced had larger heads from the outdoor sowing than the indoor sowing. Not everything was the same kind of success. There were some things that the minute she planted them from the outdoor container, they bolted, and that was the end of that. So it's an interesting experiment. I mean, the truth of the matter is that Jenna has a huge indoor setup with lots of grow lights and shelving and heat mats and the whole business. And she just wanted to see what winter sowing could do. And basically she said, well, I have my setup already. I'm going to keep going. But there were some of us that don't have that setup, don't want that setup, and still want to have fun starting seeds early. So of all the things that I mentioned, not doing some of them can actually cause a problem. So just to summarize, you need enough drainage. You need to have a medium where the seeds can not only germinate, but thrive. You want to have enough soil so that they can live happily until they're transplanted. You don't want to take the seeds out too early. You don't want to plant them too deeply. You don't want to have too many that are crowding if you are not planting something in a clump and they live okay that way. I mean, if you think about nature, self-sowing plants, they just drop their seeds. They're not going to measure how far apart each seed is. So they're used to that. But it's important to have a maintenance program for moisture. Improperly watering or not watering enough. Me, because I'm an absent-minded professor, I actually put it in my calendar to go out and look at my winter sowing containers. It is not something that I think to do often enough unless I'm reminded, and that works for me. You also don't want to worry about having enough height to allow the seedlings to grow. You need to give them space. You want to put them out in the open, not where it's dark and shady and doesn't have the elements. You don't want the seedlings to stay too long. I've done that and they've just withered because they just couldn't wait anymore to go out in the world. And not being patient enough, giving up and saying, oh, nothing is growing, nothing's germinating, I'm just going to dump this and go on. Wait, be patient. They will germinate when their time is up. And the bottom line is it's not too late to try your hand at starting seeds outdoors. And I wish you a lot of success on your efforts. And we'd love to hear about them. Tiash, I'd love to know if there are any questions.
Yes, thank you, B. That was fascinating. That was fascinating. I was telling you about my milk jug. Here I have it. Just waiting to try out your stuff. All
Good.
that you've done. Let us know. I'm going to try it out this winter.
Awesome.
So we have a question from Ellen. Her first question is, can you be more specific as to the brand of the potting mix? What?
The brand of
The potting mix.
the potting mix.
Yeah.
Oh, well, as long as it's an organic mix, I don't care for the ones that have built-in moisture modules, or, these little grains of fertilizer and things. I happen to like Espoma, but I'm not here as a, as a representative for any company. I think, that Miracle Grow makes an organic one as well these days. They finally, heard the consumer and they realize that people don't always want enhanced things with all kinds of chemicals. So they also have an organic potting mix. But there is a difference between the outdoor potting mix for outdoor containers and an indoor potting mix. I would try the indoor one, but if you have the outdoor one, use that. It's not so hard and fast. It's not so hard and fast.
Thank you. The next question that Ellen asked is, I'm reading out here. Confused about the germination codes on the back of packets. For instance, New England Aster has germination code C. They germinate after 60 days of cold stratification. Does that mean I have to do the paper towel method in fridge, or can I still do this outside in the jugs?
You can do it outside if it's C and it needs 60 days, if it's outside for 60 days. You don't have to pre-soak seeds if you're doing them outside, because they will be in a relatively moist environment that's controlled, so it's going to stay moist. So you do not have to do any fridge anything if you're going to be doing winter sowing. And there is a catalog, I don't know if you can see it, that is called Prairie Moon Nursery. It's a very common reference guide for native seeds and native plants. And they have in each of their catalogs, and probably on their website as well. Let me see if I can find it. They have a whole page on germination codes. And it tells you what code A, B, C, all the way up to M are and what to do. And winter sowing essentially does that for you anyway. There are some certain things that need hot water. That's unusual. You're not going to get anything, with hot water in a winter sowing environment. But other than that, yes. So you don't need the fridge. And I remember there was a question recently about someone that said, "Oh my goodness, I put my butterfly weed seeds in the freezer or the fridge, but I didn't make them moist. Have I ruined them?" And do a germination test, or just try it. I would try it outdoors rather than indoors. Let it be moist from the beginning and let it stratify and go from there.
Thanks, B. Ellen, I hope that answers your question. We have another question from Elizabeth. She says, "Hi, B. Thank you so much for a great presentation. What is your recommendation about shelf life of seeds? I have seeds I've saved over the past few years, but I know many seed packets say that seeds expire after a year. Do you agree with that, or can I try what I have?"
Yes. Well, they want to sell you more seeds. So they definitely say, sell by December 31st, 2022. Is it going to be good now? Well, there are general guidelines of categories of plants that have a certain viable life. So lettuces and greens, they tend to be only good for about a year or so. But beans and other things could be 7 years. Tomatoes, 4 or 5 years. Squashes, similarly. So what you need to do is Google for how many years are whatever your thing is viable. Extension. And then see what comes up. And then, if it says it's generally viable for a year and you've had them for 4 years, I wouldn't even bother doing a germination test. But if it says, 4 years and yours are 3 years old, I would do a germination test and see. Because usually the germination date is a couple of weeks and you have time to do it now and see what comes up. And that's a great project for kids in elementary schools to do a germination test and hide them away in a cubby somewhere and then pick them up 2 weeks later and see what happened.
Wonderful. I'm going to get my fifth grader
Thank you.
to try this.
Okay.
Elizabeth, I hope that answers your question. I don't think we have any more questions here. Thank you, B.